Tommy Blake had always been good at reading people. It was a skill that had served him well in his chosen profession, though that profession wasn't exactly something you'd put on a resume. At 34, he'd spent more years inside prison walls than outside them, and each time he got out, he promised himself things would be different. But old habits die hard, and when you've got no real skills and a criminal record that scared off most employers, you tend to fall back on what you know. The coffee shop on Pine Street had become his office of sorts. Every morning at 8 sharp, Tommy would order a black coffee and claim the corner table by the window. To anyone watching, he looked like just another guy checking his phone, maybe waiting for a job interview or meeting a friend. But Tommy wasn't scrolling through social media or texting. He was working, studying the neighborhood like a student cramming for the most important test of his life. From his spot, he could see 3 blocks in each direction: the bank on the corner where people made their weekly deposits, the grocery store where elderly folks struggled with heavy bags, the residential streets where people lived their quiet, predictable lives. Tommy had learned that the secret to success wasn't being the toughest or the smartest. It was being the most patient and picking your spots carefully. That's how he first noticed Robert and Helen Thompson. They lived in the blue house with white shutters, third one down on Oakwood Drive. Every Tuesday, Helen would walk slowly to the mailbox, her gray hair perfectly styled despite the effort it clearly took her to make the journey. Robert would follow a few steps behind, his cane tapping against the sidewalk in a steady rhythm that spoke of years of practice. Tommy watched them for weeks, building a mental file of their routines. Helen liked to tend to her small garden in the mornings, though she moved carefully and had to rest every few minutes. Robert would sit on the front porch reading the newspaper, occasionally calling out encouragement or warnings about thorny roses. They seemed like the kind of couple who'd been married forever, finishing each other's sentences and moving through life with the comfortable rhythm of people who truly knew each other. What struck Tommy most was how alone they seemed. In 3 weeks of watching, he'd never seen a single visitor. No children stopping by for Sunday dinner. No neighbors dropping off casseroles or staying for coffee. No delivery trucks bringing online orders or meal kits. The Thompsons appeared to exist in a bubble of quiet isolation that, to someone like Tommy, looked like opportunity. He started taking walks past their house in the evenings, timing his routes to coincide with their dinner hour. Through the windows, he could see them eating at a small kitchen table, the blue glow of a television providing the only light in their living room afterward. Their house was older, probably built in the 60s with the kind of windows that were more decorative than secure. No alarm system stickers on the glass. No security company signs stuck in the front yard. No doorbell cameras or motion sensors that he could spot. The more Tommy observed, the more convinced he became that the Thompsons represented everything he looked for in a target. They were vulnerable but not poor. Their house was well maintained, suggesting they had money to spend on upkeep. Helen wore nice jewelry to church on Sundays. Nothing flashy, but quality pieces that would be worth something to the right buyer. Robert drove a newer sedan that he kept spotlessly clean, indicating pride in possessions and probably a tendency to keep valuable things in good condition. Most importantly, they seemed to have no protection. No family checking in regularly. No friends dropping by unexpectedly. No young neighbors who might hear trouble and come running. They were exactly the kind of people who would be too scared to fight back and too isolated for help to arrive quickly. Tommy knew he was rationalizing, building a story that made what he planned to do seem less horrible. But he'd been down this road before, and he'd learned that hesitation was the enemy of success. The Thompsons had money, they were vulnerable, and they were alone. In his world, that combination was impossible to ignore. He spent another week refining his plan. The house had a back door that opened onto a small patio, partially hidden from the neighbors by an overgrown hedge. The lock looked original to the house, the kind of old hardware that would give way to pressure without much trouble. Tuesday nights seemed to be their routine for watching television together, which meant they'd be distracted and unlikely to hear small noises from the back of the house. The more Tommy thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. A quick job. In and out in 30 minutes, taking only what was easily portable and valuable. Cash from wherever they kept household money. Jewelry from the bedroom. Maybe some electronics if they were small enough to carry. Nothing that would be missed immediately. Nothing that would make this personal or violent. He told himself it would be gentle, almost polite. He'd explained that he didn't want to hurt anyone, that he just needed a few things and that cooperation would make everything easier for everyone involved. Most elderly people, in his experience, were practical about these situations. They understood that possessions could be replaced, but injuries lasted forever. They'd hand over what he wanted and file an insurance claim, and everyone would move on with their lives. Of course, Tommy had been telling himself stories like this for years. Every job started with noble intentions and reasonable expectations, but he also knew that plans had a way of changing once you were inside someone's house. Once adrenaline started flowing and unexpected complications arose, he preferred not to think about those possibilities, focusing instead on the simple mathematics of crime. Vulnerable targets plus careful planning usually equaled easy money. As Tuesday evening approached, Tommy felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and excitement that always preceded a job. He'd done this enough times to know that the nervousness was normal, even healthy. It meant he was taking the situation seriously, thinking through the risks and complications, but underneath the worry was something else, a feeling he recognized but didn't like to acknowledge. It was the thrill of taking control, of walking into someone else's life and turning it upside down. Tommy finished his coffee and checked his watch. The Thompsons would be settling in for their evening routine right about now. Television time, maybe a snack, definitely letting their guard down for the night. In a few hours, when the neighborhood was quiet and porch lights were going out, he'd make his move. Everything was ready. The sound came from the back of the house just after 9 o'clock, a soft scraping noise that Helen Thompson almost missed over the volume of their evening television program. She glanced toward the kitchen, then at her husband Robert, who was absorbed in the detective show they watched every Tuesday night. For a moment she considered mentioning it, but the sound had stopped and she decided it was probably just the neighbor's cat knocking over their garbage can again. Helen adjusted her position in her favorite armchair, the one with the blue floral pattern that had been her Christmas gift 3 years ago. At 75, she'd learned to distinguish between noises worth worrying about and the ordinary sounds of a house settling for the night. This old place made all kinds of noises, especially when the weather changed. The heating system groaned, the floorboards creaked, and sometimes the back door would rattle in its frame when the wind picked up. But this sound was different somehow, more deliberate than random. Helen found herself listening more carefully, her attention divided between the television and the silence from the kitchen. Robert remained focused on his show, occasionally making comments about the detective's methods or predicting plot twists with the confidence of someone who'd watched crime dramas for decades. Then she heard it again. Not a scraping this time, but a gentle clicking sound, like someone trying to turn a handle very carefully. Helen's stomach dropped as she realized what she was hearing. Someone was trying to open their back door. "Robert," she whispered, reaching over to touch his arm. "Robert, I think someone's at the back door." Her husband looked up from the television, his expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to concern as he registered the fear in her voice. "What kind of someone?" Before Helen could answer, they both heard the unmistakable sound of their back door opening. Not the normal sound of the door being opened by someone with a key, but the wrong sound. The sound of someone pushing their way inside without permission. Helen felt her heart start racing as she realized their worst fear was coming true. Robert struggled to get out of his recliner, his arthritis making quick movements difficult. "Stay calm," he told Helen, though his own voice was shaking. Maybe it's just someone who got confused, looking for help. But even as he said it, Robert knew that wasn't true. People who needed help knocked on the front door and called out to identify themselves. They didn't sneak through back doors in the dark. He managed to stand up just as a figure appeared in the doorway between their kitchen and living room. The man was younger than their own children would be now, maybe in his 30s, wearing dark clothes and moving with the careful confidence of someone who didn't belong but intended to stay. He wasn't wearing a mask, which somehow made everything more frightening. This wasn't someone trying to hide his identity because he planned to leave without being seen. This was someone who didn't care if they could identify him later. "Don't move," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't make any noise and nobody gets hurt. I just need a few things and then I'll be gone." Helen gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles went white. This was really happening. After 75 years of living safely, of believing that bad things happened to other people in other places, someone had broken into their home. The violation felt almost as shocking as the danger. Robert, despite his fear, felt a surge of protective anger. This was his house, his wife, his life that this stranger was threatening. "You need to leave right now," he said, trying to make his voice sound stronger than he felt. "We don't have anything worth taking." The intruder smiled at that, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone has something worth taking, old man. The question is whether you're going to make this easy or difficult." Tommy Blake looked around the living room, quickly cataloging potential valuables while keeping one eye on the elderly couple. The house was neat and well-maintained, filled with the kind of possessions that accumulated over decades of careful living. A nice television, though older than what most people owned now, family photos in expensive-looking frames, a china cabinet displaying dishes that were probably worth something to collectors. But what caught his attention were the details that suggested real money. Helen's wedding ring caught the light from the television, and he could see it was substantial. Robert wore a watch that looked like it might be worth a few $100s. On the mantel above the fireplace, there were several decorative items that appeared to be genuine antiques rather than reproductions. "Here's how this is going to work," Tommy said, moving further into the room but keeping his distance from Robert. "You're going to tell me where you keep your cash, your jewelry, anything valuable and portable. You're going to do it quickly and completely, and then I'm going to leave. If you cooperate, this will be over in 10 minutes and nobody gets hurt." Helen found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "We don't keep much cash in the house. Just a little bit for emergencies." "How much is a little bit?" Tommy asked. "Maybe $200, Robert answered honestly. "In the kitchen drawer by the phone." Tommy nodded, filing that information away. $200 wasn't much, but it was a start. "What about jewelry? Wedding rings, necklaces, anything your family might have passed down?" Helen's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where she wore a simple gold necklace that had belonged to her mother. The gesture wasn't lost on Tommy, who made a mental note to check her bedroom for a jewelry box. "Most of it's in our bedroom," Helen said quietly, "but it's not worth very much. Just sentimental pieces, mostly." "I'll be the judge of what it's worth," Tommy replied. "What about bank accounts? Credit cards? How much could you withdraw if you had to?" Robert felt a chill as he realized this wasn't going to be the quick grab-and-run robbery he'd initially hoped for. This man was talking about bank accounts and credit cards, which meant he was thinking about more than just taking what was immediately available. "We're retired," Robert said. "We live on Social Security and a small pension. We don't have access to large amounts of cash." Tommy studied the couple more carefully. They seemed genuinely frightened, which was good for maintaining control, but they also seemed to be telling the truth about their financial situation. That was disappointing but not unexpected. Most elderly people living alone weren't sitting on huge amounts of liquid wealth. Still, there were other possibilities. What about family? Children who might be willing to help out if their parents were in trouble? The question hit Helen like a physical blow. The truth was that their son David was deployed overseas, somewhere they couldn't contact him even if they wanted to. Their daughter lived across the country and called maybe once a month. They had no family nearby, no one who would miss them if they didn't answer the phone for a few days. "Our children live far away," Helen said carefully. "They wouldn't be able to help even if they wanted to." Tommy sensed there was more to that story, but he also recognized an opportunity. If these people were as isolated as they seemed, he had more time than he'd initially planned. He could be thorough, methodical, make sure he found everything worth taking. "All right," he said, settling into a chair across from them. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to search this house room by room, and you're going to sit right here and stay quiet. If you try to call anyone, if you try to leave, if you do anything other than exactly what I tell you, this situation becomes much more complicated for everyone." The threat was delivered in the same calm tone he'd been using, but the meaning was clear. Helen felt tears starting to form in her eyes, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense of helplessness. They were trapped in their own home, at the mercy of someone who clearly had experience with situations like this. Robert reached over and took his wife's hand, trying to offer what comfort he could. They'd been married for 52 years, through good times and bad, but nothing had prepared them for this. All they could do now was hope that cooperation would keep them safe and that somehow, this nightmare would end without anyone getting hurt. The flight from Germany had been long, but Captain David Thompson couldn't sleep during the journey home. After 18 months of deployment, The anticipation of seeing his parents was too strong to allow for rest. He'd managed to catch an earlier connection in Chicago, which meant he'd arrive 3 days ahead of schedule. The surprise would be worth the exhaustion. David had planned to call his parents from the airport, but something made him change his mind. Maybe it was the excitement of being back on American soil, or maybe it was the simple desire to see the look on their faces when he walked through the door unannounced. He'd been away for so long, missing birthdays and holidays, staying connected only through weekly phone calls and occasional video chats when the internet connection was strong enough. The taxi ride from the airport took 40 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that looked exactly as he remembered them. The familiarity was comforting after months of foreign landscapes and unfamiliar faces. This was home, the place where he'd grown up, where his parents still lived in the same house they'd bought when he was 5 years old. As the taxi pulled up to the blue house with white shutters, David felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. The front yard looked smaller than he remembered, and he noticed his father had been struggling to keep up with the landscaping. The hedges needed trimming, and there were a few weeds in what had always been his mother's pristine flower beds. It was a reminder that his parents were getting older, that time had continued moving even while he was away. David paid the driver and grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk. He still had his house key, though he hadn't used it in almost 2 years. Walking up the familiar sidewalk, he could see the warm glow of the television through the living room window. His parents would be settling in for their evening routine, probably watching one of those crime shows his mother had become addicted to during retirement. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the front steps. David paused for a moment, savoring the anticipation of the reunion that was about to happen. His parents had no idea he was coming. They thought he wouldn't be home for another week at least. The surprise was going to be perfect. But as David approached the front door, something felt wrong. He couldn't quite identify what it was at first. Just a subtle sense that things weren't as they should be. The house was too quiet maybe, or there was something different about the way the lights were positioned inside. His military training had taught him to trust these instincts, to pay attention when his subconscious picked up on details his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. David set down his bag and moved closer to the front window, trying to get a better view of the living room. What he saw made his blood run cold. His parents were sitting in their usual chairs, but something was terribly wrong with the scene. They were sitting too stiffly, too formally, like people posing for a photograph rather than relaxing in their own home. And there was someone else in the room. A man David didn't recognize sitting across from his parents in a chair that had been moved from its usual position. Even from outside, David could see the tension in his parents' posture. The way his mother's hands were gripping her chair, the protective way his father was leaning slightly toward his wife. David's mind immediately shifted into the analytical mode that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. This wasn't a social visit. The body language was all wrong, the positioning too confrontational. Someone was in his parents' house who shouldn't be there, and his parents were afraid. Moving carefully away from the window, David pulled out his phone and considered calling the police. But that would take time, and he had no way of knowing how much time his parents had. The situation inside could escalate quickly, especially if the intruder panicked at the sound of sirens approaching. David had spent the last 18 months in situations where quick decisions could mean the difference between life and death. He'd learned to assess threats rapidly and respond with the appropriate level of force. Right now, his parents were in immediate danger, and he was the only person in position to help them. He moved quietly around to the back of the house, staying low and keeping to the shadows. The back door was standing slightly open, which confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't a family friend or unexpected visitor. Someone had broken into his parents' home. David's military training kicked in fully now. He knew how to move silently, how to assess a tactical situation, how to neutralize threats with minimal risk to civilians. But these weren't just any civilians. These were his parents, the two people he cared about most in the world, and they were being threatened by someone who had invaded their home. The back door opened onto the kitchen, which connected to the living room where he'd seen the confrontation taking place. David could hear voices now, low and tense. His mother's voice, higher pitched than usual with stress. His father trying to sound calm but clearly frightened. And another voice, a man's voice, speaking with the kind of casual authority that suggested he was in control of the situation. David paused just inside the kitchen, listening carefully and trying to assess exactly what he was dealing with. From the conversation, it sounded like the intruder was alone, which was good. The man was asking questions about valuables, money, bank accounts. This appeared to be a robbery rather than something more sinister, which meant the intruder's primary goal was theft, not violence. But David also knew that situations like this could turn dangerous quickly. Elderly victims sometimes tried to resist when they should cooperate, or they moved too slowly and frustrated their attackers. Criminals often escalated to violence when they felt like they weren't getting what they wanted fast enough. Moving with the silent precision he'd learned in combat zones, David positioned himself just outside the living room doorway. From here he could see the back of the intruder's head and his parents' faces. The fear in their expressions made David's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. The intruder was sitting casually, like he had all the time in the world. He was younger than David had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of confidence that suggested this wasn't his first robbery. That confidence would work against him now because it meant he wasn't expecting any surprises. David took a deep breath and tried to think tactically rather than emotionally. The intruder appeared to be unarmed, at least with any visible weapons, but that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. David had size and training advantages, but he also had to be careful not to escalate the situation in a way that might put his parents at greater risk. The conversation in the living room continued, with the intruder pressing his parents for information about where they kept their valuables. David could hear the strain in his father's voice as he tried to convince the man that they didn't have much worth stealing. His mother was barely speaking, just occasional whispered responses that suggested she was close to panic. David knew he had to act soon. The longer this situation continued, the more likely it was that someone would get hurt. His parents were elderly and fragile, and the stress alone could cause serious health problems. But he also knew that surprise was his greatest advantage right now. Taking one more moment to assess the positioning in the room, David stepped silently into the doorway. The intruder still had his back to him, still completely unaware that the situation had changed. David's parents looked up and saw him, their expressions shifting from fear to shock to hope in the span of a heartbeat. It was time to end this nightmare and bring his parents' attacker to justice. The moment David's parents saw him standing in the doorway, their faces changed completely. Helen's eyes went wide with a mixture of relief and terror, afraid that her son's unexpected arrival might make everything worse. Robert's expression shifted from resignation to hope, but also concern for what might happen next. Both of them understood instinctively that the situation was about to change dramatically. Tommy Blake was still focused on Helen's jewelry box, which he'd finally convinced her to retrieve from the bedroom. He was examining a pair of pearl earrings when he noticed the shift in his victim's expressions. Something behind him had captured their attention, something that had transformed their fear into something else entirely. "What are you looking at?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. He'd been in enough of these situations to know that unexpected changes usually meant trouble. Still holding the earrings, he started to turn around to see what had caught their attention. "Hello there," David said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent years dealing with dangerous situations. "I think you should put those down and step away from my parents." Tommy spun around completely, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Standing in the doorway was a man in military fatigues, obviously just returned from deployment based on the duffel bag visible in the hallway behind him. This wasn't some elderly neighbor or concerned citizen. This was someone young, fit, and trained for exactly these kinds of confrontations. "Who are you?" Tommy demanded, though he was already calculating his options. The soldier was blocking the most direct route to the back door, but there was still the front door, assuming he could get past this new threat. "I'm their son," David replied, taking a step into the room. "And you're trespassing in my parents' home." Tommy's mind raced through possibilities. He'd done his research, spent weeks watching this house. There had been no sign of family members, no visitors, no indication that anyone else was involved in these people's lives. The appearance of a son, especially one in military uniform, was a complication he hadn't planned for. "Look, soldier boy," Tommy said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "This doesn't have to involve you. I'm just collecting a few things and then I'll be gone. Nobody needs to get hurt. David's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. You're absolutely right about one thing. Nobody needs to get hurt. But you're wrong about everything else. You're not collecting anything, and you're not leaving with my parents' possessions. The standoff stretched for several seconds, both men sizing each other up. Tommy was trying to decide whether this soldier was all talk or actually dangerous. David was assessing the threat level and calculating the best way to resolve the situation without risking his parents' safety. Do you have any idea what I've been through in the last 18 months? David asked, his voice remaining conversational but carrying an undertone that made Tommy take a step backward. I've dealt with people who were actually scary, in places where the rules were very different from here. You're just a small-time criminal who picked the wrong house. Tommy felt his confidence slipping. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. The soldier wasn't backing down, wasn't showing any sign of fear or uncertainty. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying himself, like this was a welcome change from whatever he'd been doing overseas. Your parents are fine, Tommy said, trying a different approach. I haven't hurt them and I don't want to hurt them. I just need a few things to help me get back on my feet. Surely you can understand that, David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Actually, I understand perfectly. You broke into my parents' home, terrified two elderly people who never hurt anyone in their lives, and you think that's somehow justified because you need money. Did I get that right? Tommy was starting to panic. This conversation wasn't going anywhere good, and he was running out of options. The soldier was bigger than him, clearly in better shape, and had training that Tommy couldn't match. But Tommy also knew that desperate situations sometimes required desperate measures. Listen, Tommy said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Maybe we can work something out. I don't want trouble with a military man. Why don't you just let me walk out of here and we'll forget this whole thing happened? David's posture shifted slightly as Tommy's hand moved toward his pocket. Years of combat experience had taught him to watch for exactly this kind of movement. Keep your hands where I can see them, David said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used when dealing with actual enemies. And take your hand out of your pocket very slowly. Tommy realized he'd made a mistake. The movement had triggered some kind of response in the soldier, something that suggested David was prepared to escalate things physically if necessary. I'm not armed, Tommy said quickly, slowly withdrawing his empty hand. I was just reaching for my phone. Sure you were, David replied. Here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to sit down in that chair, put your hands on your knees, and wait for the police to arrive. Tommy looked around the room desperately. The soldier was still blocking the path to the back door, and the front door would require him to get past all three family members. He was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. I'm not going to prison again, Tommy said, his voice rising with desperation. I can't do another stretch. You don't understand what it's like in there. David's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained ready. I understand more than you think. I've seen what desperation can drive people to do. But this isn't the answer. Breaking into people's homes, terrorizing elderly folks, that's not going to solve your problems. Helen and Robert had been watching this confrontation in fascinated silence. They'd never seen their son in this kind of situation before, but it was clear that military service had changed him. He moved with confidence and authority that hadn't been there when he'd left for deployment. This was their little boy, but it was also a trained soldier who knew how to handle dangerous people. Tommy was sweating now, realizing that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. Look, maybe we can make a deal. Your parents seem like nice people. I'm sure they wouldn't want to see you get hurt trying to be a hero. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. David's expression went completely cold, and he took another step forward. Are you threatening my parents? No, Tommy said quickly, raising his hands. I'm just saying that sometimes trying to be a hero makes things worse for everyone involved. David smiled, and Tommy realized that smile was more frightening than any expression of anger would have been. You know what's funny? You keep calling me a hero like this is some kind of grand gesture, but this isn't heroic at all. This is just a son protecting his family from someone who doesn't belong here. The room fell silent again, tension crackling between the two men. Tommy was trapped and running out of options. David was in complete control and knew it. Helen and Robert were watching their son handle a crisis with capabilities they'd never seen before. Tommy made his decision. If he was going down, he might as well go down fighting. Tommy Blake made his move suddenly, lunging toward the front door in a desperate attempt to escape the impossible situation he'd found himself in. But desperation and panic made him clumsy, and his 18 months away from any kind of physical training showed immediately. David had been expecting something like this. He'd seen the signs in Tommy's body language, the way his weight had shifted, the quick glances toward possible escape routes. When Tommy made his break for the door, David was already moving to intercept him. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Tommy got 3 steps toward the front door before David caught him with a textbook takedown that would have made his training instructors proud. One moment Tommy was running, and the next he was face down on the living room carpet with his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that made resistance impossible. "Stay down," David said calmly, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Tommy struggled briefly, then realized the futility of fighting against someone with professional training. The soldier's grip was unbreakable, positioned perfectly to control his movement without causing unnecessary injury. This wasn't the work of someone who'd learned to fight in back alleys. This was military precision. Helen had been holding her breath during the brief struggle, terrified that her son might get hurt trying to protect them. When she saw Tommy subdued and David clearly in control, she felt her knees go weak with relief. "David," she whispered, "are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mom," David replied without taking his attention off his prisoner. "Dad, can you call 911? Tell them we have a home invasion suspect in custody and need police and probably an ambulance." Robert was already reaching for the phone, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the last hour finally caught up with him. "Should I tell them you're military?" he asked, unsure of the proper protocol for a situation like this. "Just tell them the situation is under control and that we have the suspect restrained," David said. "They'll figure out the rest when they get here." As Robert made the call, David assessed Tommy's condition. The man was breathing hard but didn't appear to be injured. The takedown had been clean, designed to control rather than harm. That was important, both for legal reasons and because David had no interest in causing unnecessary damage to someone who was already beaten. "What's your name?" David asked Tommy, keeping his voice conversational despite the circumstances. Tommy was silent for a moment, then realized there was no point in refusing to answer. "Tommy Blake." "Well, Tommy Blake, you picked a really bad night to break into this particular house," David said. "If you'd come here last week, you probably would have gotten away with it. If you'd come here next week, same thing. But tonight, you ran into someone who spent the last year and a half dealing with people a lot more dangerous than you." Tommy felt the weight of his terrible luck settling over him. Of all the houses in all the neighborhoods he could have chosen, he'd somehow picked the one belonging to the parents of a recently returned combat veteran. The odds against such a coincidence were astronomical, but here he was, face down on a carpet with his criminal career probably coming to an end. "I wasn't going to hurt them," Tommy said, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to defend himself. "Maybe not," David replied, "but you terrorized 2 elderly people in their own home. You made them feel unsafe in the place where they should feel most secure. That's almost as bad as physical harm." Helen moved carefully to the couch, her legs still unsteady from the stress of the evening. "David, honey, when did you get home? We weren't expecting you until next week." "I caught an earlier flight," David said, still maintaining his hold on Tommy. "I wanted to surprise you. I guess I got a surprise instead." Robert finished his call to 911 and sat down heavily in his recliner. "They're sending units now. They said to keep the suspect restrained until they arrive." "That won't be a problem," David said. "Tommy here isn't going anywhere, are you, Tommy?" Tommy didn't respond. He was too busy thinking about what came next. This would be his 3rd arrest, which meant serious prison time under the 3 strikes law. His life of petty crime had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. The sound of sirens began growing louder in the distance, multiple vehicles approaching the quiet residential street. David could hear the neighbors starting to come outside, drawn by the commotion. This kind of excitement was rare in their neighborhood, and word would spread quickly. "Mom, Dad, are you hurt at all?" David asked, finally turning his attention to his parents' well-being. "Did he threaten you physically?" "No," Helen said, wiping tears from her eyes. "He was scary, but he didn't actually hurt us. He just wanted our money and jewelry." "He searched the house," Robert added, "went through our bedroom, the kitchen, everywhere. But he didn't damage anything or get violent." David nodded, filing that information away for when he spoke to the police. Tommy's restraint in not escalating to violence might work in his favor during sentencing, though that wasn't David's primary concern right now. The first police car pulled into the driveway, its lights painting the living room in alternating red and blue. David could see officers approaching the front door, moving carefully since they were responding to a home invasion call. "Police are here," David announced to Tommy. "When I let you up, you're going to move slowly and keep your hands visible. Any sudden movements and you'll be back on the floor." "Understood?" Tommy nodded, resignation replacing the desperation that had driven his failed escape attempt. The game was over and everyone knew it. 2 officers entered the house after identifying themselves, and David quickly explained the situation. They took control of Tommy, handcuffing him and reading his rights while David, Helen, and Robert gave preliminary statements about what had happened. As the police led Tommy outside to their patrol car, David finally allowed himself to relax slightly. The immediate danger was over. His parents were safe and the criminal would face justice. But the emotional impact of the evening was just beginning to hit him. "I can't believe this happened," Helen said, reaching out to hug her son properly for the first time since his return. "If you hadn't come home tonight." "But I did come home," David said, holding his mother close. "That's what matters. You're both safe, and that guy won't be bothering anyone else for a long time." Robert joined the hug, and for a moment the 3 of them stood together in their living room, grateful for each other and for the twist of fate that had brought David home at exactly the right moment. Later, after the police had finished their investigation and the neighbors had gone back to their houses, the Thompson family sat together on the couch, finally able to talk about what had really happened. David told them about his deployment. His parents shared stories about their quiet retirement, and slowly the terror of the evening began to fade into relief. "Welcome home, son," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to have you back," David smiled, looking around the familiar living room where he'd grown up, where his parents had built their life together, where a criminal had tried to steal their sense of safety. "It's good to be home, Dad. It's really good to be home."